Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this important discussion on immigrant rights. My name is Karen Gonzalez, and I have the honor of working for Congresswoman Valerie Foushee. On behalf of the Congresswoman and our team, thank you for joining us on this important discussion. Tonight, we'll begin with a panel of immigration law professionals who will provide expert insight into the current landscape. After that, we will open the floor for a listening session where community members can share their experiences, challenges, and ideas. Your voices are powerful, and this space is here for you. Now, it's my honor to introduce our host for this evening, someone who's been a steadfast advocate for immigrant rights and a champion for justice in Congress, Congresswoman Valerie Foushee.
Thank you so much, Karen. I am Congresswoman Valerie Foushee, your federal representative for North Carolina's 4th Congressional District, which includes all of Durham and Orange counties, as well as parts of Wake County and Chatham County. It is an honor to be here with you tonight for our Know Your Rights webinar, and I appreciate you for taking the time to join us this evening. In just a couple of short weeks, we have seen the Trump administration vilify immigrants across the nation, attempt to end birthright citizenship, and implement executive orders which undermine our immigration system. My office has heard from hundreds of constituents regarding these issues, and I'd like to thank you once again for taking the time to be here and engage in this critical discussion. Immigration is not just a policy issue. It's about people and families and the strength of our communities. We know that immigrants face countless challenges, from navigating complex legal systems to facing discrimination and uncertainty. And that is why we are here this evening, to ensure that everyone, regardless of where they come from, understands their rights, has access to resources, and feels empowered to make their voices heard. Now, before we begin, I would like to thank and introduce our panelists for this evening, all who have dedicated their careers to fighting for immigrant rights and will help guide us through these key issues. First, we have Michelle Delgado, an attorney with the ACLU of North Carolina. Michelle has extensive experience in civil rights litigation and community education, having worked as an attorney advisor for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and as an assistant public defender in Durham County. Next, we have Megan Deutsch Blanco, an immigration attorney who works closely with a variety of individuals across the world, providing up-to-date legal guidance regarding immigration. And we are also joined by Kelly Morales, the executive director of Siembra, North Carolina, a community-driven organization which advocates for immigrants and Hispanic communities in North Carolina. Together, our panelists bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this discussion, and I am grateful for their willingness to share their expertise with us tonight. So again, thank you all for being here, and now let us begin our discussion. Michelle, you have the mic.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. As she said, my name is Michelle Delgado, and I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of North Carolina, and I'm here to discuss the immigration-related executive orders and recent policies. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, let's get started. So what is an executive order? An executive order is essentially a written directive from the president that directs some sort of action from departments, such as creating a rule or declaring a new policy. What is important about executive orders is that they cannot override the United States Constitution or federal laws and statutes. When the Trump administration took office, there were several executive orders that kind of came out on the first day. So we're going to go over a couple of them as it relates to the immigration field. The first of which, initial recessions of harmful executive orders and actions. This one basically rescinded a lot of the Biden era immigration enforcement priorities, directives, guidance related to asylum seekers, and the reunification of families and immigration. So basically, this order got rid of a lot of prior executive orders. Protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. This one is a really popular executive order. A lot of people know it as the Ending Birthright Citizenship Policy. Essentially, what it says is that if a mother who gives birth to a child here in the US is here unlawfully, and the father is not a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident at the time of the child's birth, then that child is not granted birthright citizenship. And let's say if the mother is here lawfully, but temporarily on some temporary status, and the father is not a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident, then in that instance, the child will again not receive birthright citizenship. This is very concerning because it does seem to violate the 14th Amendment. I am not the only one that believes that, as there have been many lawsuits across the country that were filed. One was filed by the ACLU along with other immigrant rights advocates. They filed in New Hampshire, and in that case, the federal court issued a preliminary injunction to block the enforcement of the EO. So basically, a judge in New Hampshire agreed that this may violate the 14th Amendment. So until the case plays out, the Trump administration cannot enforce this executive order. On the West Coast, the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project filed a similar lawsuit. And on February 6th, the Washington State Federal Court issued a preliminary injunction as well to block the executive order. The most recent news regarding this lawsuit is that yesterday, the Ninth Circuit denied the Trump administration's motion for emergency stay. Basically, emergency stay is asking that the preliminary injunction not be enforced, that they stay that order. So the preliminary injunction remains. There are several other lawsuits going on across the country for the same reasons, and that is the status of that executive order. The next one, declaring a national emergency at the southern border of the United States. Basically, in this executive order, the Trump administration declared that America's sovereignty is under attack and that we are being invaded at the southern border by cartels, criminal gangs, and terrorists. The reason why this is important is because if the Trump administration declares national emergency, then the president is able to activate the military's reserve under Title 10. And so what concern this raises is that the Department of Defense can deploy as many units or members of the armed forces to the border. And so this can lead to a potential large scale deployment of military forces to the border. This can allow the military to use drones and funding to build more of a border wall. And under this executive order, the Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security have 90 days to let the Trump administration know their recommendation on whether they should invoke the Insurrection Act. What that act does is allows federal troops to engage in civil law enforcement, which means that if this act is invoked, that military personnel can be used for immigration enforcement, again, increasing the amount of people who will be charged with immigration enforcement activities. This next executive order is about clarifying the military's role in protecting the territorial integrity of the United States. This executive order is basically an add-on to the last one I just spoke about. In this order, the Secretary of Defense will deliver to the president a revised unified command plan, which basically is about the mission to seal the borders and repel forms of invasion. So more planning for the defense at the borders. The next executive order is guaranteeing the state's protection against invasion. A lot of people are calling this one the 212F proclamation. In this executive order, again, the administration is declaring that we are under an invasion at the southern border. And so by declaring that, they're able to use a 212F power to suspend entry and bar people from arriving at the border who are planning to apply for asylum or any other protection. It's a very long executive order that details a lot of ways that they're shutting down access to the border for those seeking asylum. On February 3rd, immigrants' rights advocates in the ACLU sued the Trump administration because this effectively creates a total ban for those who want to seek asylum. And as most of us may know, like seeking asylum is a protection that was expressly granted by Congress. So that litigation is pending. The next executive order designating cartels and other organizations as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designating global terrorists. What this executive order does is it designates cartels and other trans organizational groups as gangs, and they're targeting those groups from Venezuela, Mexico, and other Central American countries as foreign terrorist organizations. And what this executive order wants the Department of Homeland Security to do is to create an operational plan and prepare facilities for those that will be targeted under the Alien Enemies Act. What this act is basically whenever this country is under a time of war or invasion, which in this case, the administration is declaring we're under an invasion, if the president can enact the AEA. And what this does is it targets non-citizens who are over the age of 14, so teenagers as well, kids, who are natives and citizens of countries that have been deemed as hostile. And once you are targeted under this Alien Enemies Act, you can be restrained, secured, and removed. So this executive order is basically making preparations for possibly invoking this act. The next executive order is securing our borders. And this is a pretty long executive order that details a bunch of different things that the administration wants to do related to immigration, such as building a permanent wall, detaining undocumented immigrants crossing the border. It wants to resume the Remain in Mexico policy. This policy was implemented before, and basically what it does is that people who are seeking asylum will be ordered to wait in Mexican border cities, and there's no concrete time on how long they want to wait. And the reason why this is concerning is that what was seen is that groups of people were targeted because they were aware that there were groups of people waiting in these cities, which means that they were left as targets for extortion and possible violence. So that was very concerning. And this executive order also ceases the use of the CBP-1 app. So that's the app that you can use for the Customs Border Patrol services, like scheduling appointment if you're seeking asylum and accessing other immigration-related forms and documents. This executive order also terminates the process for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans for parole programs. It also orders the DNA and fingerprinting of all undocumented people. So it's basically a long list of directives to target the immigrant community. The next executive order is protecting the American people against invasion, but people are referring to it as the fast track deportation policy. It lists many things that they want the Department of Homeland Security to do, which is here in this paragraph, such as registering unlawful non-citizens, creating fines and penalties, going over limiting parole. But what's most important out of this whole entire executive order is that it's directing the Department of Homeland Security to expand expedited removal. And so if you're someone who has been here for less than 2 years, or even if you're here for more than 2 years, but you cannot prove that, then you will be put in expedited removal process. The ACLU is suing the Trump administration for this executive order because with this massive expansion of the fast track deportation, is causing people to go through a process that isn't fair and could violate their due process rights. They're saying that basically you will have more due process and more of a fair hearing contesting a traffic ticket than you would your deportation under this fast track method. The next executive order is realigning the United States Refugee Readmissions Program. Basically, this order is giving 90 days to review the whole entire process for people who seek refugee status. The next executive order is protecting the United States from foreign terrorists and other national security and public safety threats. If you recall the Muslim travel ban, this is related to that. It's basically going over the visa vetting process, and it's directing the Secretary of State in the Department of Homeland Security to create a list of countries that warrant suspicion and should be labeled a security risk, and removing nationals and individuals from those countries, as well as reviewing people who have been labeled a refugee or stateless for possible deportation. I'm sorry if I'm going so fast. I just want to make sure we get through it. But the next executive order is defending women from gender ideology, extremism, and restoring biological truth to the federal government. A lot of people have heard of this one. This is the executive order that declared that in the United States, there are only two sexes, male and female. It essentially erases the transgender community. And this relates to immigration because under this EO, it will ensure that male assigned at birth individuals are not detained in women's ICE detention centers. And it will also ensure that federal funds are not expended to any medical procedure, treatment, drugs, medication that is for the purpose of conforming an incarcerated person's appearance to that of their opposite sex. Another executive order that was issued is the restoring the death penalty and protecting public safety. This executive order directs the Attorney General to pursue federal jurisdiction where they can and to seek the death penalty, regardless of any other factors, and especially for the murder, if there's a murder of a law enforcement officer or if a capital crime is committed by an undocumented person. The Attorney General is also going to encourage state attorneys to bring state capital charges for all capital crimes, again, regardless of other factors. And it will ensure that states have access to the drugs needed to carry out lethal injection. And a lot of people have heard of Guantanamo Bay and the controversy of having people incarcerated there. Well, under this executive order, they want to expand Migrant Operations Center there for those who are challenging their deportation. There is a lawsuit against this executive order that the ACLU is involved in. And the main concerns is that there's really no information about how people will access their families, their attorneys, what the legal process will look like, what will the conditions be. There's pretty much no information of what will happen once people are transported to this facility. So it's very concerning. There's concerns of due process, access to legal help. This is not an executive order. This is a policy that the Department of Homeland Security issued. I wanted to highlight it because everyone has been pretty much aware of this and it impacts a lot of people. The Department of Homeland Security used to have a protected areas policy, meaning that immigration enforcement was not allowed in places that benefit the community, such as schools, healthcare facilities, and places of worship. On January 20th, this policy has been rescinded, which means that students, people going to the hospital, people praying, are going to be vulnerable to immigration enforcement in these locations. So just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware of that and that everyone takes the time to learn your rights, just in case immigration agents enter these special locations. And that is all, but thank you for having me.
Thank you, Michelle. So thank you for sharing. Before we move on to Megan, I do want to remind our participants that you are able to submit your questions via the Q&A feature on your screen. So with that, we'll turn it over to Megan.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. And the goal of my presentation will be a little bit more to be on the practical side. For anyone listening, whether it's you concerned about your own rights or rights of your friends or community members or family members, my goal is to provide you with an overview. I know that lawyers get a bad rap for liking to say it depends, but the answer here is it depends. There are some principles, as the ACLU knows very well, some general principles that apply regardless of someone's location or their individual circumstances. But we'll talk a little bit about whether it's in your car, your house, or in more of a public place, what rights you do have, and some best practices for any potential interactions with government agencies. And I'll just say overall, the advice is to stay calm, breathe, and to not try to resist or obstruct any government agencies that never, or officers, whether it's law enforcement or federal immigration agencies, and to certainly not lie or give false documents. What I always tell my clients when they're interacting with a government official, whether it's in an interview or something like this, is that if you don't know, it's okay to say you don't know or to say nothing, and it's better to do that than to tell someone what you think that they want to hear. As we'll discuss, there are some circumstances in the car in particular where you are legally required in North Carolina to give identity documents and to provide your identity, but that doesn't mean that you need to continue to give more information. When you're ready to stop giving information, you can always exercise your right to remain silent. I'll also say before we get into that there are, I think Kelly's going to go into a lot of the great community services going across the state, where we're looking at these theoretical, what can we do if we have an interaction with the government officer, but it's really important to know what you can do today, how you can prepare your family, and that's a lot of the conversations that my colleagues and I are having. What should you do in case you were to be arrested and detained by immigration? And I'll say that as I was reviewing this, one of the things is just to memorize phone numbers, which we're all guilty of. We all have our cell phones, and make sure that you have the phone numbers memorized of your family members, of your lawyer, if you have a lawyer, if you have a case that's ongoing. This is a good time. It's probably goes without saying, but if you have had an immigration case going on for a while, or if it's been a long time since you met with an immigration lawyer and aren't quite sure what your status is, or if there's anything that can be done to help you and your family, this is a great time to meet with someone and to go over that information, and really just to think and have some difficult conversations as a family about what your plans would be if you were to be detained. Who would care for your children? What are there any emergency instructions for caring for your children? And then these power of attorney clinics that colleagues of ours are providing across the state. In these clinics, you can help get assistance with a power of attorney, so that, it's one thing to say, my neighbor, my friend, my sister could care for my child, but there are legal documents need to be put in place that give that person the authority to make decisions on your behalf, with schools, with doctors' offices, with social services. And I know these are hard conversations, but perhaps Kelly can give us some more guidance on who to contact, where to go, and how to get in touch with these some of these clinics that were going on. And I'll also say that, make sure that you have copies of your immigration documents. If you have an ongoing case, I'm telling people to have copies of your receipts. Some people want a lawyer's letter. I think that a receipt is a great document to have copies of. Your immigration identity documents, if you are in need of showing those. And as Michelle just discussed, there's this expansion of expedited removal, which gives less due process rights for those that have been in the country for less than 2 years. So we are advising people to put together documents to show that you've been here more than 2 years in case something happens and it's looking like you are going to be detained, so you are able to request a bond hearing. And that's something that you can go over perhaps at one of these clinics or with your lawyer, but that's a bird's eye view of things that you can do today to feel like you're in a little perhaps better position. So as far as the legal know your rights part of this presentation, in North Carolina, it is the law that you need to show a driver's license or identification to the police if so asked. You don't have to give further information than that. But unlike being on a street or riding as a passenger in a vehicle, if you are driving a vehicle, then you do need to provide that your identification information to the police officer. That does not necessarily apply to ICE, but you do need to apply at all, Kelly's saying. So, but to a police officer, you do need to provide your identification. And depending on the circumstances, if you refuse to identify yourself, then you could be charged with resisting, delaying, or obstructing an officer in the performance of her duties. So if a police officer asks you for things other than your identification, you can politely say that the state law does not require you to provide it. And you can ask if you're being detained, you can ask why they're asking for it. Or the best practice is often just to say nothing. And so that those rights, they do, for the, we'll get into a minute if you're a passenger of a car, but that's mostly if you are driving a car. In your house, you have more of what's called an expectation of privacy. So you do not have to open your door. You do not have to say anything. You do have the right to remain silent. If law enforcement or immigration or someone are at your door, you can ask if they have a warrant. There's a lot of information out there and pictures of what is a judicial warrant versus an administrative warrant. Again, that can be tough for a non-lawyer to see and to understand, but generally something that has your name on it and that's signed by a judge is going to be a warrant that's going to allow that officer to enter your home. But you can, just because someone knocks on your door, we've heard of these impersonations, we've heard of all kinds of crazy things going on right now, and I'm sure my colleagues are seeing a lot of it as well. You can ask who the person is. You can ask for an identification. You can ask for what agency they are, why they're at your house. And the bottom line is, those are questions that you can have through the door. Once you open up your door to that officer, that you are it can be perceived as consenting for the person to then enter your home. So those are conversations you can, again, politely have through the door, to ask who the person is, why they're there. And if they don't produce a warrant, you keep the door closed and you can say, I do not consent to your entry, and you're exercising your right to remain silent. If you're on some type of probation or something like that, there are different rules that apply. And those are conversations you should be having with your lawyer. But generally, in your home, you have more of a right to privacy. And if you think, this is again going back to the same conversation, if you think you may have any type of right now outstanding criminal issue and failure to appear in court or a removal order, you should be really having some conversations with your lawyer and with your family. And that's where the it depends comes. If you're that person, you really need to be having those conversations. But if this is just a fishing expedition, then don't open your door. And then the third circumstance is going to be out in public. And for example, one example would be there's a lot of fear right now about workplace enforcement, and your employer, if there are employers on here, they have those same legal rights in their private employment to ask for a warrant. And in all of these, if I'm not saying it enough, I should be saying it more, to contact your lawyer if this is happening. Make sure that you know your lawyer's information. But if immigration does come to your work site, do not attempt to run away. That's not gonna be a good look. But it's safer to continue working. If an immigration officer were to speak with you, you could ask if you're being detained, and if not, you can calmly ask to leave. You can ask who the person is. Those same principles of remaining calm, remaining quiet, certainly apply in a workplace. And also a lot of these principles apply in more public areas, because as we heard from Michelle, there is this revocation of the protected areas policy, which has really instilled a lot of fear in people I'm talking to about ICE going into schools, going into churches. And so these are all public places. And if that were to happen, then there are those same principles that apply where the school or the church or the medical facility could ask for a warrant, could ask whose names were on the warrant. It's not just a grand fishing expedition. So and in those circumstances, if law enforcement or ICE were to be there, then you always have the right to ask to leave. And I'll just finish this. I don't want to go too far over time with what happens if you find yourself in a situation where you or a family member are detained. If you are in a circumstance where your case is underwent, you have a case pending, or if you have been here for more than 2 years, and you should be able to post bond. So as soon as possible, you want to ask to speak to a lawyer, and you want to get the ball rolling on trying to figure out representation to be able to post bond and hopefully be able to get out of detention. If you have, and don't sign anything is the big takeaway from this too. So make sure that you are trying to get your hands on legal counsel. And even if you already have a protection order, if you have fear of returning to your home country, then there are rights. It's not just an automatic deportation. Even if the immigration officer tells you that you don't have a right to see an immigration judge, you can still, you're allowed to ask for an interpreter, and you're allowed to ask to talk to a lawyer. I hate to leave it on that negative note, but these are things that all of us are seeing with, and a lot of it with some of the new both federal and state laws are first impression for how these cases are being handled right now. So it's really important that you try to meet with someone and you try to have these hard conversations with both your family and with a legal representative. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was critical, important information. We'll now move on to Kelly.
Good night, y'all. From wherever you're listening, I want to just invite everybody to just take a deep breath. My colleagues just shared really important and really scary information that many of us have been hearing in the past few months. And many of us have been trying to navigate, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my family? What does this mean for a loved one? And I want to just acknowledge how we hold this within our body, how we hold this as people living through this situation together. A lot of what SAMHSA is a statewide organization, a member-led organization, meaning we have member chapters across 10 different counties across the state. And what we believe is that come what may, we face whatever comes our way together. And so I invite that as the spirit of what SAMHSA is rooted in, as just something to always come back to as we're talking about what are the conditions that we're facing and how are the conditions going to be changing. SAMHSA is a community organizing organization. We serve a really particular role in North Carolina that is a little different from my colleagues around like policy or around like legal advice. What we do a lot of times is bring what Know Your Rights workshops look like into neighborhoods, into churches, into schools, wherever we're invited, what your rights are, and being able to practice what to do if you are in a situation where you have to engage with an ICE agent, right? Or another federal agent that is carrying out immigration services or immigration activity. What I will say is that the main piece for us is that families don't have to go through this alone. I don't know how much folks have really followed, but a lot of what is being informed by what immigration detention looks like in this Trump 2.0 world that we are in has really been summed. They really have shared a lot of their playbook with us. And one of the top things that we have been reminding our folks and our members of is Tom Homan, right, who was former ICE director and is now in charge of overseeing the security at the border, made it very clear early on this year that their main goal is for families to self-deport. How do we have families self-deporting? Creating conditions that are so scary, that are so disheartening, that the only option that a family can see is to leave. And so I want to just ground us in that, because a lot of what we're seeing is a lot of these intimidation tactics to our communities, and really seeing how the immigrant community, the trans community across the board are being targeted in different kinds of ways. And at the end of the day, we at SAMHSA here have been leaning on organizing in community to be able to survive these times. So really important for folks to know that in this moment, we have a choice to make, and there are resources that are out there for our community that some of them that we know have taken a hit from some of the federal funding around USAID. Some of our friends like Church Will Service, for example, have been really impacted by by federal funding, but also a lot of grassroots organizations and a lot of mutual aid projects that have been happening in our state remain strong as ever, remain committed as ever to continuing and doubling down on being able to provide resources to the community. So I want to just highlight that both things are true. We are seeing unprecedented time, and at the same time, we are seeing how the community is emboldened and coming together to really fight for our constitutional rights that have not taken from us, despite the fact them trying to scare us into not being able to defend them. And so some of those resources that we have to offer, I think, as Megan mentioned, there are an ecosystem of organizations, including Sambra NC, that are offering workshops in your community, in your county, where we go over all the details that Megan just described in different languages so that people know that they can ask for things like an executive warrant. 98% of all of the detentions that we have seen in North Carolina have been because an officer was able to trick someone and was able to lie and say that they had a warrant when they had an administrative warrant signed by their own office director. And so we know that there are ways in which tactics that our folks may not be able to fight back or be able to ask the right questions. And so a lot of organizations are in the community actually talking about know your rights and practicing what those conversations could look like. So it's really important to be able to see that. I'm going to drop in the chat here some graphics, really easy graphics that you can text, that you can share, that you can save on your phone. Some of these are some of the things that Megan went over. Some of these are also just pictures of what does an administrative warrant look like versus what does an executive warrant looks like. And highlighting the key places so that people who are not law-based like myself can still be able to kind of see and know where to kind of be able to identify what is the document being shown. So that's a really important resource. Another important resource that we have been able to organize around has been a statewide hotline. I'm going to drop that in here in the chat. We have a statewide hotline where you can actually report ICE activity. So what we have seen is a lot of times the number one threat has been the fear that our community is facing. And a lot of the detentions that we're seeing right now are actually happening in probation appointments or in jails that are collaborating with ICE or 287G jails. For example, like in Alamance County, Randolph County, and some of the counties that kind of surround the triangle as well. I say that to say that, again, they're creating an environment where we are so scared that a lot of our families are scared to go to the grocery store, to go to school. And so what this hotline is able to offer is if you see something, you can actually call this number and we will send and deploy a trained witness volunteer, not to intervene, but to be able to confirm what is happening in that neighborhood, what is happening in that school, so that we have verified information so that people can take precautions based off of verified information and be able to decrease the amount of rumors that we see. A lot of times we see rumors that say on Facebook, right? ICE is coming to Winston-Salem, for example. We don't know what time, we don't know where someone saw it, and we don't know who saw it. And so what we're trying to do is create a system of verified information so that we can keep each other safe and be able to dispel the amount of fear and know that we are not alone. And so that is a hotline that folks can call for any activity. We also send out text alerts for families that want to receive any alerts in terms of other resources and other kinds of verified information that we're able to gather and send out to the community. The other thing that's really important is a lot of the work, like my colleague said, once someone is in immigration detention, the options are very limited in terms of what can be done. And so a lot of what in North Carolina is being done is to try to prevent detentions from happening. Asking folks that may be at risk or have different kinds of factors that may make them at risk, making sure that they know that they need to go to an attorney. Folks in everyday life knowing that they have constitutional rights that they can at any point defend and that they should remind themselves of. And also offering this hotline so that if you or yourself are seeing some strange activity or you're hearing about it, you can call a hotline where you don't have to just make this individual assessment, but you can actually lean on a community rapid response support. What happens after someone gets detained? So after someone gets detained, the process is not easy. The majority of people who get detained in North Carolina are being sent to Alamance County, where they have an agreement for like a processing center. And if we're being honest, we have seen how the sheriff has made millions of dollars based off of expanding this program. And that's something to also just keep in mind and remind each other of a lot of how these tactics are kind of tied together with a lot of injustices that we're seeing across the South and across the country. So I want to just mention that a lot of families see their loved ones sent to Alamance, and then from there, the closest detention center is in Georgia. And so a lot of the cases that we see are folks that are sent to Georgia to kind of start their immigration process. So a lot of what we do is this process isn't easy. They're not up front in terms of who they are. They pretend to be police. They pretend to have a warrant, and that's not usually the case. And then throughout the entire time, they're using intimidation tactics to get people to sign. And so that's why Megan was saying the number one takeaway is never sign. Because once you sign, again, you are very limited on what little options you. And so what we have found is that being able to accompany someone through the process of being detained makes a big difference. And so that hotline that I actually shared with y'all is a hotline that we use to do intakes and be able to support a family who is left to kind of go through this process, to be heartbroken and go through the trauma of having a loved one go through this process. And so we're able to give a little bit of detention navigation. We're able to give referrals to attorneys who can talk and give legal advice. And then the other thing is that we also have mutual aid funds that support families who are undergoing detention. A lot of times what we have seen is that the primary bread owner is the one that's detained, and that's an economic issue that impacts the whole state. Because what we see is families that are left without a job in the home. And all of a sudden, it can be a mom that's having to now figure out how to provide for the kids while at the same time going through this entire grief process. So I say that in the sense that that fund helps in terms of legal expenses that might come up. It also just helps being able to pay the bills until they can find a term of use to stay afloat going through this process. So I'm going to put some things in the chat. I think the main thing that I want to just share is, and every time, and this is in the history, right? We here in the South have a deep history of incredible civil rights movement and organizing. And no matter where we see this kind of oppression, this level of fear, this level of telling us who belongs here and who doesn't, at the same exact time that that story is being written, the other story that's being written as well is how our people have come together to fight this, how our people have come together to build the resources to be able to survive this.
We're going to move into our question and answer period. We'll try to get in as many questions as possible. I think this first question, Michelle, probably goes to you. And the participant asks, would you please provide additional information on these executive order challenges? Are these policies allowed to be enacted while the challenges are going through the court system?
Okay. Some of the executive orders have been challenged. There's lawsuits that have been filed. The executive orders are able to be enforced unless a court has granted a preliminary injunction. So, for example, for the birthright citizenship executive order, there have been at least 2 preliminary injunctions granted by courts. So that order is not enforceable. So it really depends on which order we're talking about here and what stage of litigation they are in. And in some of the executive orders, there are no pending litigation.
Our next question is, I just learned that TSA is stopping Americans at airports and confiscating the travelers' green cards. What, if anything, can be done?
This is an example of just a lot of the bad information out there. We have not heard of any en masse revocation of permanent resident cards for someone who doesn't otherwise have a legal issue. They've stayed out of the country too long, or they have a pending criminal case. You're a permanent resident until someone takes that away, and you still have the right to travel. So that's a great question.
The next question we have is, what will be the impact on people seeking renewal of work permits or temporary status?
I think none of us have as a colleague of mine likes to say, a crystal ball. We can assume that if the system is already very slow moving, that it will only be more so by less federal employees and more vetting of cases. But we just don't know, and we can't predict that. And I wanted to follow up on one more thing on the previous case about the permanent residency cards, even though I think that is a rumor online. This is a time of extreme vetting. And so certainly we can expect for immigration to be poking in more than perhaps they would have into everything. So certainly you want to consider that and talk to your lawyer if you think there is an issue before traveling. But as far as delays, we don't know, but I think we are prepared for further delays.
Our next question, given that agriculture is an important industry in North Carolina, are there considerations to exempt undocumented workers or undocumented farm workers from the risk of deportation? I think I'll take a stab at this one because it goes back to what Megan just said. We really don't have a crystal ball to be able to look into what might come next by executive order. I think that where we are now is that what is coming is so fast and furious. We're trying to get a hold on to what can happen and what will happen. Again, a lot of these challenges will have to come before the court system to see how they play out. Until such time that we can introduce legislation that might prohibit some of these actions. But the state of play where we are now, we simply, as far as Congress goes, I can't say that we'll be able to provide an answer to this at this time. Others may chime in if you have better information. What should teachers and parents with students in our local school system know before moving forward?
Hey y'all, I can take a stab at this one. I think it's really important. I think we know that there are places that have been sacred for our communities. We know that is schools, churches, hospitals. These have been historically places where families are safe. We also know that the administration has made bold moves to try to be very vocal in terms of how these places that have been sanctuary, right, for a lot of people are now being vulnerable, and are no longer going to be guaranteed to be safe. What we are telling teachers, what we are telling folks in healthcare, we're telling folks in churches that it's just really important during this time to really just be in communication with one another. I think that we have not seen any kind of ICE activity inside of the schools as of yet. And so I think that there's still a question as to whether they are going to be moving on this. What I do know is that there are folks that are trained that are also teachers that have been pushing for school policies so that principals and school administrations are actually going to be asking for judicial warrants before anybody is permitted to walk into campus. And so it's really important. In those graphics, we shared a little bit more about what are some of the policies that schools could enact. I know that there are a few other organizations that have been working around this. So what I would say is continue to share verified information. Know that you can still use the hotline as a resource as well as a teacher if you see anything, if you hear of anything. And in the meantime, I think there's just a lot of creativity around. Someone put in the chat around mental health. We know that we're going to need to be creating places of joy for our students and our kids. And so really thinking creatively around how to really think about creating safe spaces inside your classroom.
Next, are there pro bono attorneys available for those who cannot afford a lawyer?
I'll speak to this. It's a tough time. A lot of the few nonprofit organizations in North Carolina that provide legal services have had funding cuts recently. And even before that, there is unfortunately not a lot of free legal representation, except in limited circumstances if someone has survived domestic violence, human trafficking, or if there are other compelling circumstances. And there is one organization in Charlotte, Carolina Migrants Network. Perhaps we can put their information in the chat. To my knowledge, they're the only nonprofit in the state providing free legal services for those who are detained, but also just general immigration legal services. There are some faith-based organizations like Catholic Charities, things of that nature, but there are not a lot free or low cost representation for those in removal proceedings.
And this will probably be our final question. And again, Michelle, this goes to you. If the courts find an EO illegal and hold them in contempt, who will enforce it?
If the courts find an executive order to violate our constitutional federal laws or statutes, it's just not enforceable at all. So remember that, and on my first slide, I said that executive orders are intended to direct some type of action by departments or agencies. So that order of direction is not enforceable. So the court will order that this type of action is unconstitutional or illegal.
And so, in simple terms, basically, it's null and void.
Correct.
Let's hope.
I guess I could have said that, but yes.
So, and the next part of that question is federal agencies are being shut down. So, with the U.S. Marshals, but I think that's in connection with the question that we just answered. So, pretty much, I think Michelle has answered all aspects of the question as I read it. But let me go ahead and say to our participants, of course, we could not get to all of the questions, but we have captured the questions that were put in the Q&A function, and we will try our best to get answers back to you. If indeed you have questions, please feel free to call the office, and we will work on getting information to you as quickly as we possibly can. We're going to go ahead and close this webinar and again, thank our panelists for being here with you. Thank you all again for joining us this evening. To everyone who shared their stories through your questions, your voices are powerful and essential. The challenges that you face are real, and they deserve to be heard by policymakers and leaders across the nation. Your experiences inform our fight for just immigration policies, and I am committed to ensuring that this fight continues in Congress. Keep sharing your stories with us. Please feel free to call the office when you see or you hear something that you think is troubling and you think we may be able to help in some way, or at least steer you in the right direction. As we confront the actions of the Trump administration, it is more important now than ever that we stand united, as you heard from Kelly, and I will continue to advocate for those policies and laws that properly reflect our nation's values of inclusivity and justice. Whether you are an immigrant, an ally, or an advocate, I hope you will find the information that was shared with us tonight useful and informative. And I encourage you all to stay connected with my office. We are here to support you, to provide resources, and to find solutions that uphold the humanity of our immigrants. If you ever have a question or need assistance with a federal agency, or you would like to follow up on topics discussed tonight, please call my Washington, D.C. office at 202-225-1784 or my Durham District office at 919-967-7924. We are indeed here to serve and assist you. And you can stay up to date on the work that I am doing for the 4th District by visiting my website or subscribing to my e-newsletter or by following me on Blue Sky at foushee.house.gov or on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Rep. Valerie Foushee. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and I hope you have a wonderful night.